If my apprentice wizard moves into a flooded bottomless pit with a mariner's curse on the surface, will it be killed by the bottomless pit or the mariner's curse? To answer this question, you will need to know some advanced concepts in the game of Sorcery Contested Realm. And that concept is the timeline. Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Hank from Wizard's Den. Today on how to play Sorcery TCG, I will talk about an advanced concept called timeline. Though it is not something that comes up all the time, some complex interactions requires the use of this concept to resolve everything in the correct intended order. Here are the different chapters for this episode. I will first explain what a timeline is, then explain the correct procedure to place and resolve each timeline elements, and give you a test case to illustrate how to use the timeline correctly. What is a timeline? It is a system to track all spells, movements, and abilities in the order it will be resolved. If you are an experienced player of Magic the Gathering, or have an understanding in data types in the field of computer science, you should already know this as the stack. Stack is a linear structure in which addition or removal of elements follows a particular order. Specifically, LIFO, last in, first out, or FILO, first in, last out. LIFO and FILO is effectively the same. Timeline is essentially the sorcery version of stack. Whenever a player does anything from casting a spell, use an ability, trigger any abilities due to their actions, or declare any movements, those do not resolve immediately but goes on the timeline. Everything is placed on top of each other in the order it occurred, and the last one added to the timeline resolves first. Though timeline is similar to other games' stack equivalent systems, there are some small things you need to care about that results from specific game mechanics just in Sorcery. I will go into the details in the next chapters. As timeline is an advanced comprehensive mechanic, it is not written in the main rulebook, which is intended as a beginner's guide. It's just the same as MTG not providing the tournament rules to a complete beginner and provides it separately. Rules on Timeline is currently written on a comprehensive mechanics rulebook separately. It is still in development and I think it will be released in the future officially. I will provide the current version in the description of this video. I just want to make a quick remark on one term I'll be using in this video frequently, which is the term timeline element. This is not an official term. It is a term I will use to group spells, movements, and abilities that were added to the timeline as a generic term. I just don't want to say spells, movements, or abilities every single time. Here is an overview on the rules on how you place the timeline elements on the timeline. I will explain each of them in order. Rule number 1. Break down spells, movements, and abilities into fundamental timeline elements. All spells, movements, and abilities are placed on the timeline before it resolves. When you do so, there's a specific pre-process you need to perform, and that is to separate movements and other timeline elements as separate elements on the timeline. This is a critical step for Sorcery as movement itself can trigger location-specific abilities, and the resolution of each movement have to be taken care of on its own. Also, if the movement results in multiple steps, that movement must be broken down into series of individual steps to allow any effects to resolve during the whole path of the movement. You will define the path and the final destination of the movement and place them on the timeline sectioned by each step. To illustrate this pre-process, I'll give you an example with this grapple shot. Grapple shot reads, an ally shoots a projectile. If it hits a unit, the ally is dragged to that location and may strike the hit unit. Grapple shot has two components, the movement part caused by the dragging effect and the strike portion. You will first separate them as two separate components and place it on the timeline. Striking portion first, movement portion on the top. If the movement results in more than a single step, as you see in this board state, you will separate it into individual steps, the final step being on top of the strike effect and the first step being on the top of the entire timeline. One important thing to add here is that if anything alters the path of this movement, the movement will fizzle. This is because each step is an effect that moves the chosen unit from a location to another location. So if there is a region change or a position shift, the unit is no longer in that location, so the movement will fizzle. Depending on the effect you are dealing with, this component separation have to be done on non-movement effects too. A good example is firebolts. Firebolt states, shoot 3 projectiles in the same direction, one at a time. Each deals 1 damage. In this case, you will have to place 3 separate projectiles on the timeline so it can resolve separately. Rule number 2. Place each timeline elements on top of the timeline as it occurs. There are many cases where a new timeline element is generated even though there are still elements left on the timeline. In this case, simply place the new one on top of everything else. The new one will resolve first. Rule number 3. Simultaneous occurrence of timeline elements would follow active player, non-active player ordering. If for some reason multiple timeline elements gets placed on the timeline at the same time, there is a specific ordering procedure. Multiple simultaneous timeline elements controlled by one player will be placed on the timeline in the order of that player's choice. If the simultaneous timeline elements are each controlled by different players, the active player, which is the player who is currently playing their own turn, places their timeline elements in the order of their choice first. Then the non-active player will do the same and place the timeline elements on top of the active player's timeline elements. This is called the active player, non-active player ordering, commonly abbreviated as AP-NAP. Let me give you an example. In this board configuration, you use Wind Blast. The 4 minions will each be moved 1 step towards the bottomless pit. Each pit is controlled by you and your opponent. The bottomless pit's triggered ability fires for all 4 minions at the same time. As you control the bottomless pit on square 12, you control those triggered abilities, and the opponent controls the triggered abilities generated from the bottomless pit on square 7. As you are the active player and the 2 bottomless pits ability trigger at the same time, you will place the 2 triggered abilities in the order of your choice first. Next, the non-active player, which is your opponent, orders and places the triggered bottomless pit's ability on top of your abilities in the order of his choice. The opponent's ability will resolve first, then yours. Now let's look at the rules on how to resolve the elements on the timeline. There are 2 rules for this. Rule number 1. Resolve each timeline element from the top of the timeline. This one is easy. It is the fundamental function of the timeline itself. You resolve each timeline element from top to bottom. The second rule is check static effects before and after resolution. This could include minions no longer being disabled or simply minions being marked as dead due to damage. Only start resolving new timeline elements after having all static effects in place. So as a final closing of this episode, I will give an example to illustrate how to correctly utilize the timeline. Here is the current board. It's your turn, so you are the active player, and your opponent is the non-active player. Pallery Bats is on square 18. Giant Shark is on square 3. A Flooded Bottomless Pit is on square 8, and Mariner's Curse controlled by you is placed on squares 2, 3, 7, and 8. Giant Shark is in the body of water consisting of square 3, 8, and 13. You use Grapple Shot on the bats to the Giant Shark. What would happen, and how would everything resolve? First, you will separate the strike and the movement portion of the Grapple Shot and place it on the timeline. Grapple Shot reads, an ally shoots a projectile. If it hits a unit, the ally is dragged to that location and may strike the hit unit. As the strike happens after the movement, you place the strike on the bottom of the timeline and movement on top. For the movement, you define the final destination and the path of the movement as you have multiple steps. You will section these movements into 3 separate movements. This is the final state of the timeline. As there are nothing else to add at this point, you will resolve the topmost movement. You move the bats to position 13 from position 18. This will trigger the Giant Shark's triggered ability. Giant Shark reads, Submerge, Waterbound. Whenever another unit enters or moves between sites in this body of water, Giant Shark moves to that unit to fight it. Just like the Grapple Shot, Giant Shark's ability involves a movement and a fight effect. You will place the fight effect on top of the current timeline and then the section movement on top of them. Now the resolution happens. You will resolve the topmost movement that moves the shark to the surface of the square 8 from surface of square 3. This will trigger 2 effects, the Bottomless Pit and the Mariner's Curse. Bottomless Pit reads, whenever a non-airborne minion enters this site, kill it. And Mariner's Curse reads, whenever a minion enters an affected water site, submerge it and return Mariner's Curse to its owner's hand. As these 2 triggered abilities triggered at the same time, the active player, non-active player ordering comes into play. The Bottomless Pit is controlled by the non-active player, and Mariner's Curse is controlled by the active player. So you will place the Mariner's Curse effect on the timeline first. Mariner's Curse effect involves submerging the minion, which is also a movement. So the submerge and returning the Mariner's Curse have to be separated into 2 timeline components on the timeline. After this, the Bottomless Pit's effect is placed on the timeline above the whole Mariner's Curse effect. As there are no more triggers, the topmost timeline element will resolve. The shark will be killed by the Bottomless Pit. As the shark no longer exists in the original position, the submerged portion of the Mariner's Curse fizzles. After that, the Mariner's Curse is returned to the owner's hand as that portion of the ability is not affected. The whole movement and the fighting effect of the shark fizzles as the shark is no longer in play. Now, we finally resume the movements of the bats. Bats will move to the top of the Bottomless Pit, and it is not affected by its ability as it has airborne. It proceeds to resolve the last movement to position 3. Finally, the strike portion will fizzle as the hit unit, which was the shark, no longer exists in this location. Note that even though the shark moved and died at the Bottomless Pit, The bats moved all the way to the initial shark's position, as the path and destination was predefined when the movement effect was placed on the timeline. This is the full resolution ordering using the timeline rules I explained in this video, and it has covered all elements of the resolution ordering that you would need to know. It may sound intimidating at first, but if you grasp the fundamentals, it would be easy. Make sure you review every single timeline elements until you understand why these were placed and resolved in this particular order. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for future episodes regarding sorcery. Thanks for watching, and until next time, have a great game.